Hello, Peter Blackwood. Welcome back to Icon Diary. I'm writing a icon of Dag Hammarskjöld, and before I start painting I want to get to know him a little. So I've been reading this little piece from Dr. Roger Kalla, who is the chair of the Swedish Church. So Dag Hammarskjöld, born 1905, died tragically in a plane accident in 1961. He was a Swedish economist and diplomat. He was appointed second secretary of the United Nations. His father was Prime Minister of Sweden for a time, from 1914 to 1917. The young Dag grew up in a rarefied environs of Uppsala Castle, which was the residence of the governor of Uppland, another high position his father held for a while. By 1930, Dag had obtained the Licentiate of Philosophy and Master of Laws degree. Before he finished his law degree, he had already been appointed Assistant Secretary of the Swedish Government Unemployment Committee. He wrote his economics thesis and received a doctorate from Stockholm University. He developed a successful career, becoming the youngest secretary in the history of the Central Bank of Sweden in 1936, and was soon promoted to serve as the chairman of the central bank. He was the governor of the central bank from 1941 to 1948. Hammarskjöld appears on the new 1,000 krona denomination note that the Swedish Central Bank recently printed and released. Although Hammarskjöld served in a government cabinet dominated by the Social Democrats from 1949 to 1953, he never officially joined any political party, remaining politically unaligned. He became the chairman of the Swedish delegation to the United Nations General Assembly in New York in 1952. Under Hammarskjöld, the United Nations became more actively involved in maintaining world peace, even if it meant sending out UN troops to areas of civil unrest. Hammarskjöld's second term was cut short when he was killed in an airplane crash while en route to ceasefire negotiations during the Congo crisis in 1961. He is one of only 4 people to be awarded a posthumous Nobel Prize. President John F. Kennedy named him as one of the finest of statesmen that dedicated his life to serve the peace and the people around the globe. Kennedy also proclaimed that in honour and tribute to Hammarskjöld after his death, the national flag should be flown at half-staff on all government buildings of the United States. After his death, among the personal effects, poems and haikus were found. They showed another side of the aristocratic diplomat, namely of a deeply spiritual soul on a constant quest for personal enlightenment. The poems were later translated into English by W.H. Auden and appears as markings by Dag Hammarskjöld in the Vintage Spiritual Classics series. As a little aside, I can remember my father reading and loving this book, Markings by Dag Hammarskjöld. Like many Swedes today, Dag Hammarskjöld charged his batteries and took solace from the demanding position in the natural landscapes of Arctic northern Sweden, also known as Lapland. This landscape also captured the imagination of Hammarskjöld. Many of his short poems in Japanese haiku format are based on the brushstrokes of poetic language that derive from the innermost depths of his soul, and in equal part from observations of the surrounding landscape. Another space where his spirituality took concrete form is in the creation of a room of quiet in the UN headquarters. It was personally planned and supervised in every detail by Hammarskjöld and was opened in 1957. Here is a little haiku by Dag Hammarskjöld. A sky as blue as that above the snow crest before the last ski run. So I'm using as a model this photograph of Dag Hammarskjöld sitting at his desk in the UN building in New York. Now, I want to be sure to fit my photo into my panel, which is of a different size. So I want an 80mm head, and that will go same distance to the middle of the chest, and twice the head for his width. I want to fit a nose length above the head so that I can fit in the halo. So now I can get started. This is going at 8 times normal speed. So with a pencil I'm roughing in the basic places, the basic areas, and then with water and yellow ochre and a hog hair brush I'm mapping in the main features, getting the size of the head, where the centre of the head is. I'm adding some egg tempera now to that mix so that now the paint is more obvious. Starting to refine the image just a bit. Now the hands in the photo are fairly close together. He's actually holding a pen between his fingers in the photo. I'd like him to hold something else, something a bit more significant. We'll see it later on. So I'm putting the hands a little further apart than in the photo. As I look back on what I was working on, I can see the mistakes that fortunately I did see later on and corrected, but we'll see those corrected too. I keep the mistakes in because this is a diary, not a tutorial. I'm documenting what I discover along the way and how I fix problems. A great deal of art is fixing problems. There's a problem for starters, that the two shoulders are completely unequal. I've added a little bit of Mars Black to this mixture so that it's a bit more obvious. Also, this will be the mixture that I'll use for making a lot of the shading. It's not too dark. And there was a mistake. The eyes weren't aligned. Need to raise that eye. When I paint membrane over the top of these shadings, it will be helpful not to have these markings, these shadings, too dark, to use a black or even a burnt umber, which I have used in the past to good effect. But then have to use a lot more coats of membrane to cover it up. We want to paint over these guidelines because they're just guidelines. We want to be able to see them underneath. Starting to put in a little circle between the hands. And this is a big circle I'm putting in with Mars black, and this is something I really don't do. That is, put the halo in at this very early stage. And the reason is that I want to have the background colour cover the halo, so the halo can be seen through the background colour. So that's why I've put it in now. Now this whole thing will be a study in blue. In fact, the only warm colours in this icon will be the skin tones. Everything else will be cool, very blue. And the three blue pigments that I'm using are ultramarine and cobalt and cerulean. This is cobalt with burnt umber, and at this stage there's just way too much burnt umber. Indeed, these two colours can make a nice black. Well, it's just too close to black. And by about now we've covered up all the shading underneath, as I put more on to try and get the blue to show through a bit more. More cobalt, less burnt umber. Now this was an interesting experiment. It didn't work. I was scraping through to the gesso these lines because in the photo Dag Hammarskjöld is wearing a pinstripe suit. So wouldn't it be interesting to put the pinstripes in? So the original idea was to put the pinstripes in now and then put the highlights over the top in the hope that the white would show through, that the pinstripes would show through. It didn't work. As soon as I started to put anything over the top, just lost all the pinstripes. So, in my Dag Hammarskjöld, he's changed his suit to plain old blue. We're adding titanium white to this base colour for the first highlights, using quite a large, I think a number 6 Kolinsky brush. A tiny bit more titanium white. Now we're not getting a lot of variation. I don't want bright white highlights here. Just keep it all quite subtle. It's a large space, and to put lots of heavy contrast in will draw the eye away from face and hands and important things. That's my reasoning anyway. Now with a bit of cobalt blue, I'm making a circle. I had already used a pair of compasses with a pencil to make the circle. A few coats of this to blue it all out, and also to use cobalt blue to blue in the white shirt. This is so that there's some shading when the white goes on. I've added some ultramarine blue to titanium grey, and using my number 8 squirrel mop, I'm putting in background and hoping that the black halo will show through. I've done this a few times with this series so that the background is also the same, or it merges straight onto the desk that the saint or holy one is leaning on. I'm also using, some of the suit dark colour as shading for the tie. But for this, I'm going to use cerulean blue, which is a lovely, bright, greeny blue. Don't use it very often, but it's stunning when it bit more cobalt blue on that circle. Now, when I completed the design on that circle, I didn't film it. I actually painted it with it on my lap because it required some fairly, well, you'll see, close, dexterous work and a bit of compass work. So we're starting to put on titanium white. It's going on in thin layers. It's on top of the thin layer of cobalt blue. But we'll keep adding coats so that the bits that I want to be bright white will get brighter and whiter, but that the blue shading underneath will give some texture and shape and depth to the shirt, so it doesn't come out just as a flat bit of white. Now I'm mixing some yellow ochre and a bit of Ercolano red and a bit of terra verte, a bit of green, and doing the membrane for the flesh tones. Oh, and look, he's holding on to his cobalt disc, and it is the United Nations symbol. Much more interesting than the pen that he's holding between his fingers in the original photo, in the model that I used. So this took quite a number of coats of this membrane until he looked alarmingly orange. And with a little tool and some titanium white, I put dots on his tie. And I also, at this stage, traced in the his name, the inscription, and with a fine 0 Kolinsky brush and titanium white pigment, painted Dag Hammarskjöld. When I came back to do the shading, before I did some more of the membrane, but this time I added more terra vert, more of the green, and it took some of the orange out. But then using that as the base colour and adding white, began to put in the highlights. Find hands, particularly in these kinds of interesting postures, quite tricky. It's now with the highlighting stage that varying the highlights quite drastically is what will persuade the viewer that the hand is shaped, that it is curved, that the wrist is turned away from the knuckles. A bit more titanium white. So on these fingers and knuckles, more white than on the rest of it to help give it shape. The photo gave me good guidance on that. To say that we did move away from an orange face to later on quite a white, too white a face, but there's always a way of fixing that. This isn't pure white, this is just simply white added to the flesh tones, the yellow, ortolano, red and terra vert. But we can see that the face is starting to shape up, starting to get some roundness into it. So blending a bit more, and now with a watered down, diluted version of the base colour, I did a glaze over the top, and that took the chalkiness out of the features. I'm using raw sienna here, and I don't often use raw sienna, but it's my new favourite colour. It's quite streaky, but for using it here, it's working really well for defining some of the features, getting some of the shading back in, particularly between the fingers. And I think it's working better than where at other occasions I would have used a burnt umber. I just think I've learnt something here. But now I've added some titanium white to my raw sienna. Using a fine Kolinsky brush for the hair. Now, Ercolano red with some Mars black added to go over the main features. And it starts to shape up a bit more. looks less ghostly or ghastly. Some blue in the eyes, in the irises, and some knocked back white, quite a bit of flesh tone in the white so that it's not too glary. And using some of that for other bits of highlight, just very sparingly. And some red, Ercolano red for blushes. And there we have an icon of Dag Hammarskjöld. Thank you for watching. See you next time.